Do you have a website, an external presence, employees, an office? Any of these things can be compromised and attacked. How are you defending these assets? Have you penetration tested these public assets? Start 2017 by taking a proactive approach to securing your vulnerable areas. Black Hills Information Security has been helping companies find their weaknesses since 2008. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com and see how they can help you sleep better at night.
Well, the studio looks beautiful, and Paul had some stuff he had to go take care of, so you're not stuck with me. I'm still here. We've got a fantastic interview. We're just having a chat off camera, so we're going to get right to that. But let me remind you, if you haven't yet, go to itprotv/startup security. Use the code SS30. You get to try it absolutely free for 7 days, and then you get 30% off your monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription. They also have a team solutions. This is something you've heard Paul and I talk about a lot more. And when you go take a look at it, or you talk to the team at IT Pro TV, you realize it's really impressive. It gets you the types of insights that you need. But what's cool about the team solution is you can assign training to people. You can see who's followed up with it. You can track the whole thing. So we're going to start using a little bit more ourselves, and we'll keep telling you how awesome it is. But if you haven't yet, this is a great time to go take a look at that. We got a holiday week coming up if you're in the U.S. Good time to get some training on. So I'm excited. Our special guest, our interview today is Darren Mar-Elia. He's part of Semperis now, but I'll tell you what, and it was neat because we're just comparing some of the circles that we've run in. He's got a background in cloud. He's worked with Microsoft. He's done identity management. He's started a company. He's worked in large enterprises. So he's figured out, like when we look at the business of security, he's figured out how to sell. He's figured out how to market and explain stuff. He's figured out how to solve some pretty cool problems. And now he's the head of product for Semperis. And what they're doing is Active Directory protection. So this is something we keep talking about because, well, attackers have figured out it's a pretty good approach for them. So we're going to talk about a lot of this. Darren, welcome to the program. I'm excited that you're here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited too. And I, again, apologize for the mess behind me.
Isn't it a sign of success, right? It's everything.
It's a sign of success.
Kind of puts itself
Actually,
together.
if I tilted the camera a little lower, you would see my 20 gallons of Malbec that I'm fermenting or vinifying behind me. I make wine in my spare time, so.
Well, yeah, that's actually kind of cool, and I feel like it fits in with our program. So, you know, I don't have 20 gallons of wine lying around, but if I did, it probably wouldn't last for too long. So
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about. I'm actually just kind of curious because you said you're a fairly new hire. So what's it like to be the head of product? What's it like to come into the company? Tell us a little bit about your pathway and your journey and why you're excited about being there.
Yeah. So it's been a great opportunity. So I actually, as you mentioned, I started a company called SDM Software about 11 years ago that was focused on Windows group policy technology. So as many of your listeners probably know, group policy is that sort of configuration technology that's built into Active Directory. And that was sort of a niche that I got into as an IT guy early on when we were doing original Windows 2000 AD deployments. And
when you say it was a niche you got into, does that mean, Darren, you drew the short straw, and suddenly you're the guy?
Sometimes,
how do you solve that problem?
I actually feel that way because group policy is sort of the redheaded stepchild of Microsoft configuration management these days, especially. But you know, it was an opportunity. I was always interested in configuration management in the early days of Windows, and especially in large networks. I was working at Charles Schwab at the time, and we were rolling out, before Windows 2000 and AD, we were rolling out NT3.5 and NT4.0, and you know, thousands of workstations spread across branch offices all over the country. And how do you configure them? How do you centrally manage them? We were actually an SMS 1.0 guinea pig way back in the day, and
Wow.
the notion of being able to mass configure Windows servers and desktops was interesting to me. So I took it as a challenge and worked into group policy after AD shipped, and I've spent time in the Microsoft infrastructure ever since. I even though I say I'm a Microsoft guy, I've done everything from web performance engineering to InfoSec to network engineering. So, you know, pretty much anyone that's been in IT for any period of time, you usually end up doing lots of different jobs. So, and I even love to write code. So, but anyway, that path that path took me to meeting Mickey Bresman, who's the CEO of Semperis last year. I think we met first at the Microsoft Ignite conference, and we got into a long conversation about what they were focused on and what I had been focused on and how we might work together. And for me, it's an opportunity to work in an area that I think is really interesting. I actually, my most recent IT gig was working in identity at Autodesk, Autodesk being a large software company. And so I got to see some of the day-to-day challenges of managing identity in a relatively large organization and the complexities of identity. And the one thing that struck me is that, 17 years on, Active Directory is still sort of the backbone of identity in a lot of organizations. And in fact, with the advent of cloud-based applications, SaaS applications, the need to be able to authenticate and authorize to those, and the advent of SAML and federation, you've seen the kind of the importance of AD go from this sleepy little desktop operating system directory to now being the backbone of identity for internal applications, external applications, systems, everything from authenticating to ILO cards in servers to authenticating to Salesforce, ultimately using AD for that authentication authorization backbone. So AD has actually become more critical, if not over time. I think it's kind of an interesting evolution. So when Mickey approached me with what they were doing at Semperis, it was a pretty cool opportunity to lend some of my experience and kind of broad context on the sort of identity space to what they were up to. And so it's been fun, and as you know, in a startup environment, you want to move as fast as possible. And for me, the challenge is, there's all this stuff I want to do, and you just have to pace yourself, right? You can't do everything immediately. But we're really focused on two main areas today, which is sort of the disaster recovery of Active Directory. So we call it forest recovery, but ultimately so ultimately, if AD is that kind of critical backbone, the last thing you want to have happen is for it to go away for any period of time. And it used to be that there were maybe a few things that would cause AD to go away. Maybe you uncommonly corrupt the DIT file, or you would make a schema change that would go horribly awry, or something like that. And there was no easy way to recover from that. So some of those things are irreversible. So you would have to recover your forest from scratch. And Microsoft has a white paper that sort of describes the process, and it was this sort of painful 900-step. I'm exaggerating, but it was,
of course,
lots of scripts and lots of rigmarole. And in a large organization, if you've got a large multinational organization, I mean, you're talking days of being down, and that's not acceptable. And now we've seen in the security realm, we've seen attacks that are targeting Active Directory. Not only attacks to get information out of Active Directory to improve the lateral movement through the organization, but also attacks where Active Directory either on purpose or accidentally is getting encrypted with ransomware. So we have found interest in the forest recovery capability. What we've essentially built is literally a single button push to get back to a fully functional forest out of nothing. Right, so your forest is.
Oh, that's interesting. So that seems like one of those wow statements that probably catches a lot of attention.
It does, and for large organizations where, again, like multinational companies that have thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, being out, having your Active Directory completely non-functional for any period of time almost means that the business just stops functioning. And that's so the forest recovery capability has been a really good starting point in the conversation. And then the other side of the equation, which I'm particularly interested and fascinated in, is a so-called State Manager product. State Manager, it's really about change tracking and auditing of Active Directory, but it does it in a way that's a little bit unique. So what we do is when we find out about changes to the directory, we're finding out about them through the same essential API calls that directory domain controllers are making with each other. So we go and ask a domain controller where our agent is sitting, what's the last set of changes that you got since the last time I talked to you? And we bring those changes in and we store them in our own repository. And so we have this change history, this state of Active Directory over time that you can revert to at any point in that state. So if it's a script gone awry that has blown away group memberships on 1,000 groups, or if it's just a simple oops, I accidentally deleted the CEO's user account, we can revert those changes, bring everything back to the way it was before, and then we can also tell you who made those changes. So that the kind of the audit aspect of it is how do I know who made the change? Maybe it was somebody that shouldn't have been making changes. So that's a great solution for sort of managing the day-to-day oopses in Active Directory. The other end of the spectrum being the forced recovery, where that's the big oops, where you really do need the undo button, and so we kind of cover that space, that spectrum of recovering AD. Yeah, so it's been fun.
I know you're kind of new to it. Is that the problem that you set out to solve? Is that when Semperis got started? Was that the goal? Is we need to be able to recover because this stuff is just nuts? And so is that, or have you, as you've learned about it, has it evolved a little bit as it's gained market share?
I think I can't speak to the early days, but I know that Guy Tverovsky, who's our CTO and one of the founders, he had spent many moons as a Microsoft PFE in Europe, helping customers to either plan for Active Directory disasters or recover from Active Directory disasters. So he had a lot of field experience in this problem and knew how painful it was. And so I think all along the motivation had been, how do we make that problem less painful for customers? And I think what's evolved is sort of technically how we do it. The state manager having come out of that, sort of technically how that works and how we track changes in AD as compared to other vendors in the space that do it differently. And then, how we can sort of manage that life cycle of changes that are happening over time to the point where, if there is a disaster, the customer can recover. So I think what's changed probably since I've come on board, because I brought a perspective about the things that we talked about before the interview started, about the exposure of AD as a potential source for nefarious activity, and that increasing exposure. I've been really interested in this ever since I went to a Black Hat talk last summer on Bloodhound. I'm sure you've heard of Bloodhound and the work that those guys did around using information in Active Directory to inform lateral movement around the organization to find juicy targets. And so I've been really interested in that, originally from a group policy perspective, but now more generally from an AD perspective. How do we build solutions that give customers insight into those attack paths and help them protect themselves against them? And so that's, I think, what I'm really interested in going forward is, how do we our tagline is, identity protection. How do we protect the identity backbone? Today it's Active Directory, but you can imagine going forward that there are other identity stores, both on-prem and in the cloud, that we would be interested in protecting as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking about the number of times I've looked at identity in the enterprise and just the sheer number of identity stores. It's bigger than people think. But I liked calling it the identity backbone. That's a really clever way of thinking about it. So what I've seen in the past is when we try to do identity, security will have a play. And a lot of times it ends up being that, they're the ones who create the IDs. They're the ones who do stuff. But Active Directory is a lot of times more of an IT function, or a lot of the recovery stuff you're talking about. So
right.
Who are you finding is interested? Is this where you're finding security meets operations, or are you learning to speak with a lot of different groups to figure out, like, what are you finding in that? Because what you and I talked about before we came on camera is this isn't a new challenge for people. I think you point out something important. The rise of the cloud has definitely exacerbated what I think a lot of people quietly knew. So the challenge is real. and people have known about it for a long time, and we've found painful and interesting ways to work around it, and they're not really getting us where we need to be. So as you're coming forth with the solution and saying, "Oh no, we know how to solve it," who's paying attention, and what are you learning from those conversations?
No, that's a really good question. So I think to your point, we're having conversations with both sides. And so I've worked on both sides in IT, and I know how that relationship can often be fraught. So the IT guys have a focus on keeping the systems up, and often they get policy and dictate thrown over the wall to them from the security side, whereas the security folks often feel like they're somewhat hamstrung in terms of what they can do because the IT guys, have their own agenda and they're trying to do their own things. And I think we have seen and are so it really does depend on the customer. Some customers are further along in having the security and IT functions more closely integrated, but we're having conversations with both sides. And sometimes you go into a customer and the IT side is driving it. The day-to-day, we need to be able to undo changes. We need to be able to know who's making changes in AD from an operations perspective is coming in. But then on the security side, they want to know, who's being added to domain admins, who's being added to privileged groups in AD, who's doing other changes to AD that could be indicative of attacks being launched against us. So we're getting those conversations coming from both sides. I wouldn't say that it's a perfect there's a perfect formula there yet. We'd like to have a story that appeals to both, but you also have to be careful not to you can confuse the message as it were, in terms of as a software company, your goal is to sell your software into the organization, and so you want to have as laser focused a message as possible and as few points of approval as possible. I mean, just to put it bluntly, right? You want to find where the budget is. You want to find where the budget is, and then you want to get your solution in for that pain point that person has with the budget. So I think the challenge is we do have a security message. We also have an IT ops message. The hope is that the IT shop you're selling into is sophisticated enough to see the value on both sides, but that's not always the case. So you sort of have to tailor your message depending on the organization. So I think that's really what I found.
No, and what I like is I felt like you spoke that really candidly, but in a really artful way. And I'm always impressed by that. But you also have a background writing and tap dancing around quite a bit, and so I mean that as a compliment. I mean, like I sat there thinking, wow, that was a lot more artful than I would have done. So that's fantastic. So Darren, when you come into a role like this,
it comes from working on both sides. So I've been on both sides.
That's actually where I wanted to go with this. So what's it like to be head of product? Because I think that's one of those titles that a lot of us hear, and it's like, right. So what do you do? So with your background, you've started companies, you've worked in large enterprise, you've actually had to go configure the policy manager. Like you've got a pretty good depth of experience. How does that come together? What does that mean that you're the head of product?
Right. So I mean, in a startup, as we all know, the title, it means less than what you actually do day to day. But here's how I think about it. I do demos and I talk to customers about their problems and whatever. But here's how I think about it. So my goal is to figure out it's split in half, and maybe it's not rough. It's not exactly 50-50, but it's both to find out what the customers need out of our solutions and to find out and to figure out what they don't know they need, right? So it's always the mix of you want to be doing things that are innovative, that are seeing the problems before the customers see them, but you also need to be responsive to what the customers need today. And so my goal is to build out a product roadmap that addresses both of those challenges. And it's not easy, right? Because especially as a startup, your goal is how do I bring the deals in? How do I get marquee customers? How do I run a business? And so we want to be able to do things that are meeting today's needs. And if a customer says, we really wish you did X, then we want to figure out how we're going to do X as quickly as possible. And frankly, it's one of the advantages of us over a larger vendor is that the chance of us doing X in 3 months is probably about 200 times more than a company that's a 20,000 person software vendor. We want to be able to take advantage of that nimbleness, but we also want to be able to look out beyond that and say, how do we solve the problems that are coming up that the customers haven't seen yet? And that's kind of that secret sauce, that key innovation stuff is what I've been tasked with, and that's what I like to do. I had that role I was CTO at Quest Software's, in their Windows management division in the early 2000s, and that was the most fun part of my role. I did a lot of acquisition stuff for them, but the most fun I had was dreaming up the next big thing that was going to be interesting to customers and solve interesting problems. So that's always been my focus, and that's what I try to do with Semperis.
No, it's interesting too, because Paul and I talk about that a lot on this program. I like to call it falling in love with the problem publicly, and it sounds like you get to do that because if we go look at what it takes in order to own your category or to be that category king, if you followed along with Play Bigger, you either have to solve a problem that people didn't think was solvable, or you have to show them that they have a problem they didn't even realize. And it sounds like you're kind of doing both, right? You're coming to Active Directory and saying, "Hi, I know you think you're stuck. You're not stuck. Oh, and by the way, here's a couple of things you haven't thought about, but we have." Now, as a startup, though, you're in a position where I've got a question. I'm curious how you handle this. We always talk about the importance of finding those first couple customers and then building those relationships and then asking people for feedback. No doubt people are coming to you with the stuff they'd love to see. So when you're looking at the roadmap, how do you decide how to keep your customers happy? And yep, this totally should go in, and this maybe, and this stuff, no way. What's that like?
It's a great question. It's a really good question, and it is part art and part science, just like winemaking. I always had to bring it back to that. So the key for me is, it's not super complicated at some level, in that if I'm hearing the same thing from multiple customers, we're talking to customers every day. If I'm hearing the same thing, or if I put my IT guy hat on and I say, "Gee, I wish our product had this," then that is probably something we need to do sooner rather than later. And so there's been a couple things where even since I've been on board, we've had conversations with customers, and it's like, yeah, that needs to be there, and we need to get that done soon. Then there's other stuff that you hear from customers, and usually it comes from the customers that are really on the cutting edge. We talk to a lot of smart IT guys and gals, and we really do get some really amazing ideas about things that we should be doing. And those will get put into the list of, we are definitely going to do this. It's not going to be tomorrow, but it's going to be out there on the roadmap. And then there are some things that we always get, and I'm guilty of this too. I totally sometimes will geek out on a technology, on a little corner of technology, and I'll say, this needs to be solved. And it turns out that, maybe it needs to be solved for me and 2 other of my friends, but we're the only ones on the planet that really care about that. And I learned this lesson in spades building group policy solutions. The very first solution that I built was a group policy troubleshooting toolkit, and because I spent most of the years preceding that helping people solve group policy problems, because it was so complicated and it didn't work the way it was supposed to half the time. And it turns out that people, even though that sounded really good and it was really kind of a neat little problem to solve, to troll through trace logs and group policy processing, no one was willing to spend money on that, and they were okay with just living with the problem. So I think that the challenge is hearing the customers, getting a consensus on something, and then also knowing when you hear kind of a gem idea and being able to move that forward into the product.
Yeah, in fact, those are the 2 takeaways that I just got listening to you. The first part is, if you talk to enough people, you kind of recognize when you're sitting with somebody or a team, and you're like, oh, That's it. I like that idea. I don't know where it fits. I got to write it down. But then let me ask you if this second part would kind of match up. I don't know how many of our audience have done improv or have looked at stand-up comedy or not. But a common misconception a lot of people have is that funny people are always funny, and that people who have good joke sets, it's just kind of naturally come to them. And they don't realize that they really grind it out. And it starts from this quick observation, and they kind of carry it around in a notebook, and they build it out, and eventually they start testing it out. And when you talked about some of the ideas, like, it's kind of like when a comic says, well, I just did that joke for me, right? And they tap the mic, that was for me. It sounds like to be good at figuring out the roadmap, you need to have, maybe it's humility, maybe it's just audacity, but you kind of need to keep testing out ideas, perhaps not by saying, hey, I've been working on this idea, let me test it out with you, but by throwing some stuff out there every now and then and watching how people respond to that. Does that fit into it? I mean, that's a part of the
Absolutely.
art of it. Okay.
It is. I learned that lesson at Quest because we had an idea for a product, and it was something that hadn't been done before. It was actually related to Active Directory, and we really thought it was going to be an amazing thing. And we went out and talked to customers about it, and the response that we got initially was, yeah, that's neat, but can you do this more mundane problem over here? Mm-hmm. Which was sort of a side benefit of what we were working on. We didn't think it was going to be the main thing, but it ended up being the main thing. And so you sort of learn that sometimes, and I've learned this in spades having my own software companies, is you can overthink solutions, and sometimes the real solution that people need and want is much more mundane. So you have to be able to go out and iterate through an idea and to find that sweet spot of, and it may not be as exciting as I want, or as, you might have had the idea about initially, but it ends up solving a lot more problems for folks. So we definitely.
It sounds too, if I added a third dimension to it, it would be figure out what somebody's willing to pay to solve versus that's awesome. I would love it if you did that. Would you pay for it?
Yeah.
No, but you should totally do that and just roll it in versus you can solve that. Yeah, I got budget for that problem. So do you bluntly ask people, like, as you're figuring stuff out, do you get so far as to say, is that a feature you'd pay for, or is that a benefit? Like, how do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's easy for me to do that in the context of a sort of roadmap discussion. Like I'm not a salesperson, although I've had to be, right? But salespeople are notoriously good at. I mean, I have tremendous respect for salespeople because I'm not the kind of person that can that can bluntly ask for money. But what I can do is, in the context of a technology conversation or a roadmap conversation, I can say, is this something that you think you could find budget for? And that's a perfectly reasonable conversation to have. And IT people appreciate that. I appreciate, as a former IT person, I appreciate the fact that a lot of companies, they have this very rigid budgetary process where if you haven't already dreamed up what you need for the next year in like September or October, then it's probably not going to happen that next year, right? Unless some magic pot of money shows up. So you sort of have to be sort of, me as a roadmap technology guy, I have to be sensitive to the fact that people may not find budget for this, and oftentimes budget comes in very kind of simple or oversimplified categories, like we need to do privileged management. So next year we're going to have a privileged access management project. So everything we do is going to be privileged access management products. And that kind of mindset, it's not great because it reduces your ability to find these sort of like, aha type of products. But it's just the way IT shops, especially larger shops, have to work, right? They have to have a structure to what they're doing.
I think it's a really good point. And so I want to turn it around and think about what that experience could teach any of our security leaders that are watching this today on how to better navigate that process on their side, because I know you've got experience there. But what I picked up out of what you just shared, and I really liked it, was by asking about where you could find budget for this. Look, I'm no holds barred. I always tell people there's funding available. If you've got a problem to solve, And
Right.
anytime I work with the board or an executive team, bring it to them, let them make a decision on where and how to spend the money. They'll
Right.
be able to do that. But if I'm a vendor, that's a pretty shoddy way to hope someone's going to figure out how to fund whatever I can
Right.
help them with. And asking about where the buckets of money are and where the budget is and what the process
That's
looks
right.
like gives you a chance on the roadmap to go slot it so they don't have to fight for it. It's already there, and that
Right.
makes it easier. So flip that around then. Knowing what you've learned on this side of the table, think back to your enterprise experience, and this will be a good place to give our listeners something to think about. How would you then either budget for something differently or otherwise manage that process so when they find a solution that they like, how can they ease that process for themselves?
Right. So there were several times. So it really depends on your position in the organization. I was usually in a position of architect or director of infrastructure or something like that, where I was in charge of setting the priorities for our particular, or at least the desired priorities for our particular technology area. And what I would try to do is there were some must do projects, right? So you get dictated to in terms of things that you have to do. So, you're being told by the security team that you have to put a privileged access management solution in place, or you have to. In fact, I was involved in a project like that. So we were basically given the mandate: you got to get rid of all these admins all over the environment. Okay, great. So we know we have to do that. But then I also have this sort of care and feeding type stuff that every IT shop has, because they're always running around with their hair on fire. They never can get ahead of things. So how do we build some sort of discretionary? I mean, you have to put a business value around it. You can't just say, I have a bucket of money to make things better, quote unquote. You have to put some business value around it. Maybe it's, reduce the delivery time for software configuration settings, or reduce the downtime of my desktops and servers due to bad configurations or something like that. So you put something around it, and then you ask for a project for the next year. We need a project to do this, and assuming you make a good business case for it, you get some money for it, and that gives you a little bit more flexibility to find tools not that don't fit into some rigid bucket. And occasionally, as an IT guy, I would get into a situation where, and it didn't happen very often. Most often, it happened during boom times. I was at Charles Schwab during the .com boom, which was an amazing experience. But anyway, there would be times where our managers would come to us and say, we have X million of dollars that we have to spend by the end of the quarter. That's a really bad, that's a tough problem.
Wow, you had it rough. I don't know how you survived
I had it
that.
rough.
It's interesting. It almost seems like if you're on the other side, think about it the same way as a roadmap, right? What are the problems internally that people would give budget for, and just canvas it broad enough to give yourself a little bit of flexibility to be able to do it. I love it.
Yeah. And so I think I was a big proponent of, even though I was always on the infrastructure side, I always like to emulate the application guys, the guys that were doing the line of business apps, because A, I worked with a lot of smart folks on that side of the world, and B, they always had a sort of strategy and a vision around where the platforms were going. And so even though we were just doing quote unquote plumbing, I always tried to have a vision for what we were doing. And I even gave it fancy names and gave it logos and things like that, so that people would understand that, this is a project, this is something we're trying to move the infrastructure forward. And I think that helps a lot if you can have what looks like a vision, even if it's just infrastructure.
I like that a lot. Wow, that's a great tip. I think everybody's going to benefit from that. And hopefully they'll get a chance to go look at some ways to protect the identity backbone by taking a look at your stuff.
Right.
Where can they find you? I know you do some other stuff as well. So they can go to, is it Semperis.com?
Semperis.com is where we do our identity protection stuff for Active Directory. And
it looks like you're active on Twitter?
I'm active on Twitter at Group Policy Guy. And gpoguy.com is the site that I founded back in, 2003, 2004 for everything related to group policy information. And I have a blog on there too. So gpoguy.com. Yeah.
I think a lot of people are going to find that really exciting. Thank you so much for your appearance on Startup Security Weekly and sharing all your insights. It's I know I had a blast, so I'm hoping everybody else did too. I learned a lot, and I appreciate all your candor and time. And that does it for this episode. Startup Security Weekly, it's in the books. We'll see you again next week.